Well, we've got another fall harvest season behind us on our farm, and a lot of farmers do around the country as well. We want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we learned, both from our own operation and from farmers that we work with around the United States.
All right, well, when we talk about lessons learned in soybeans, it's the same thing almost every year. People give up on soybeans way too early.
Right.
You think about it, this year, for example, we were behind. Most of the country, the soybeans were 2 or even 3 weeks behind where they normally were at. And we got out to the third week of August, and a lot of guys hadn't really seen much for aphids or spider mites in our area, and all of a sudden they showed up. But people thought, you know, the beans are gonna start turning real soon here. I'm just gonna let it go. And the guys that did spray versus the ones that didn't, it made a huge difference.
Yep, because the big thing is corn, a lot of the yield is made relatively early in the season. With soybeans, so much of the yield is made late in the season. Now that doesn't mean you can do everything wrong in the beginning of the year and still end up with a great crop. You gotta do it good all the way along. But all we're saying here is, yeah, it might be dry in the middle of the summer, whatever, who cares? Soybeans actually like that in the middle of the summer. They like a drought year in the middle of the summer, and they like sunlight. We had a lot of fields that were yielding over 60 bushels with basically no rain for 2 months in the middle of the summer, but then we did have some August rain. We had 1 rain in August, 1.5 inches, and bam, 60 bushel beans on mini fields.
Okay, a lot of guys now over the last few years have been spraying fungicide whenever they're spraying the insecticide, figuring if the bugs are biting the plant, they're opening it up to disease, I better protect against disease as well. Well, this year, since we were so far behind, many people were concerned about, I don't want to have green stems at harvest.
I know.
I don't want to have my beans staying too green late in the fall. And that was a mistake leaving it out this year. The guys that were putting in the fungicide, for the most part, were getting good returns. In our fungicide trials this year, the racehorse varieties, we got a nice return on fungicide. The really defensive varieties, it was kind of hit or miss whether we got a decent return. The other thing is the time of the year that we did see some return on fungicide use in soybeans. We saw more of a return this year spraying at V4 when we had 6 or 8 inch tall soybeans than we did at R2 or R3 full bloom soybeans, like where we normally would see a good return. Part of the reason is we were wet in May and we had trouble getting into fields because many of the fields were wet. And in that case, we saw a lot of Septoria brown spot, even more so than we normally see, and it paid off pretty nicely to put a fungicide on early.
Another thing is tile, having good drainage out there. Even though, again, it was a relatively dry year, if the soybeans didn't get off to a good start, they were hurt all season long. So
well, and planting date too. Just getting in 1 week earlier at our field day site. One of the seed companies that was going to put in a little plot at our field day site, we got our plot in a week ahead of them. That was the only difference. We were a week ahead. And by the time we got to our field day in the 3rd week of July, well, our beans were probably 6 inches to a foot taller. They looked a lot better than the beans planted just 1 week later. So planting date was super critical this year in soybeans. And yeah, getting back to your drainage, for most guys, that was the difference. If they had well-drained fields, they could get in a little earlier, where if they had poor drainage, it was a challenge.
Well, for me, the number one factor, once again, and I keep harping on this every year, you've gotta have good fertility for soybeans. If you're only fertilizing your corn and not fertilizing your soybeans, I would encourage you, start running some trials on your farm, because what we found is when we fertilize soybeans, we can raise 60, 70 bushel beans. When we don't fertilize soybeans, we're dropping, we're losing a lot of yield. That's not a good thing.
You kind of hit on it though in the organic matter talk earlier, Brian. When we're thinking about it, why does that make such a big difference in soybeans? They've got 1/5 the root mass of corn. They just can't find those nutrients if we aren't getting nutrients out there that are available and placed correctly for the beans.
So if you broadcast your P&K, those soybean plants are not going to find 80% of that P&K. So yeah, that's fine. Just put on much more fertilizer. So we've been doing some long-term studies on our farm where we've gone 50% more P&K in the broadcast versus what we put on in the band for 11 years in a row now on about 500 acres one way, 500 acres the other way. In other words, 500 acres broadcast with a high P&K, 500 acres banded with a lower P&K. We're getting similar yields on both corn and soybeans.
But our cost of production is so much higher on the broadcast.
We're spending a lot more on that broadcast. So you can do it, but it's going to require more fertilizer.
Well, there's certainly a lot of things that we've learned on our farm this year in our soybean fields, and also that we've learned around the country looking at what other top farmers are doing. So pay attention. Don't just go into next year thinking, well, this is what I did last year, I'll do the same plan again for this year. You only get about 20 or 30 crops, and maybe where you're at in your life, you may only have just a few crops left. You may be close to retirement age. Now's your chance. You can get big soybean yields this coming year. Just make some changes on your farm, learn some lessons in the beans, and you could be moving ahead to higher yields.
Yeah, and the big thing is when soybeans are worth as much money as they are, you can make a lot of money raising a good acre of soybeans, so just invest a little time with it. Well, one of the things you'll need to invest time to make sure you solve in your soybean fields is controlling our weed of the week. We'll tell you how to do it coming up next.